Welcome. Good morning. Assuming this is in the morning, it's the morning here. Hello to all my friends at SrH Homes, and I'm very happy to be with you today. Well, in a sense, in spirit, being with you today. Today is actually the 16th of April when I'm recording this. I was supposed to be on a plane tonight to arrive there on the 17th and to share these thoughts with you sometime midday on the 17th of April. And I'm very sorry not to be able to be there, and not least because I'm sorry not to be able to be with my family, with my folks, who, as I'm sure many of you know, is a member of your community. And I'm nevertheless very happy to connect with you, and I can hear and I know from them and from Chris and Janet that everybody seems to be bearing up relatively well. And I wish you all the best in health and in, well, surviving is the word I was going to use, but I don't think that's quite right. In at least, well, even thriving and making our way through and dealing with this challenging time that we're facing. So, as many of you know, and some of you watching will have heard me speak before, or we have had chats, obviously, at breakfasts, dinners, or otherwise, or around the pool. And some of you may not have heard me speak before, but as those of you who have come to the events that we've held at SrH or otherwise in the community know, I usually speak about my walk on the Israel Trail, the Israel National Trail, and the book that I wrote, My Israel Trail, which, if you're interested, I believe my folks still have one or two copies at home, which I signed and left with them. But many times in discussing my experiences hiking the Israel Trail, I've had reason to talk a bit about my connection to the Jewish people, to the people of Israel, to the land of Israel, to a number of philosophical as well as psychological and emotional issues that related to my hiking the trail and my life here in Israel. And I've spoken also about some of the politics in the region, but I don't think that I've given a talk about human rights and democracy in the Middle East. That's something that I speak often on college campuses. I did so earlier this year at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and at Stanford. Perhaps we can deal with that at another opportunity. But an introduction to some of the issues involved in today's media reporting, not just about the Middle East, but China and other societies around the world. And one of the hot topics, I think, for all of us in America, in Israel, and other Western democracies today is the whole topic of human rights, democracy, freedom, how we define those issues and how we promote them. And what I was asked to speak about today is kind of a little bit of an introduction to some of the issues, specifically from the standpoint of what are the philosophical underpinnings of our modern Western ideas of human rights, basic universal rights, and democracy. And it may not surprise you to know that from the Hebrew Bible come many, if not most, of the foundations of what we consider today to be universal and accepted norms, certainly within the Western world, of an understanding of individual rights and civil rights, political rights, women's rights, minority rights, and the like. So that's what we're going to talk about today in, I hope, less than 40 minutes or so. And I'm only sorry that we can't have the kind of interaction that we usually have in terms of being able to answer your questions or discuss specific issues that might be of interest to you. And of course, I'd be delighted to respond if there's an interest, whether it's by email or otherwise, to any issues that I raise. And to questions that you may have. You can email me at rea.green@gmail.com. Janet, Chris, and of course my mom and dad can get you that email if you're not familiar with it. My mother and father are Don and Joan Green. They're in, 400 apartment 2E. So now you know. But of course you can't visit them now, but you might be able to meet them keeping our distance, our social distance of 6 feet or more, out by the pool or on the lobby balcony at some point. I do want to preface my remarks with a few disclaimers. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not even a philosopher, although I like to philosophize. I have had the privilege of studying both at the Hebrew University, studying for my master's in international relations, with some leaders in some of these studies on issues of rights and democracy. And more so, I had the privilege of working with Natan Sharansky, who, aside from being Deputy Prime Minister of Israel and a minister in Israel's government for many years, is one of the foremost human rights leaders in the world. And it's really from him, from his mentor, Andrei Sakharov, and human rights luminaries like Erwin Kotler from Canada, who is the Minister of Justice in Canada, and a number of others, that I've learned many of these concepts that I'm going to share with you today. Although I can take some credit for having researched and looked into many of them in the course of my studies, and I would say, I guess, I'm a practitioner, as it were, when it comes to issues of human rights, because that was one of my jobs with Mr. Sharansky for over a decade, connecting him to human rights activists, democracy activists here in the Middle East. But that's a topic for another time. As a student, much more so than as a teacher, I've enjoyed looking into these issues in some depth and understanding from real luminaries like justices in the Supreme Court here in Israel, like Menachem Elon, and many others, as well as some others that I'll quote for you here today. But I'm sharing some basic thoughts as an understanding of what we mean and where these concepts come from. But I don't pretend to be an expert in any way, and I'm not a rabbi either. But having said that, all of those disclaimers, let's get started. So I want to quote an interesting, I wouldn't call him a luminary, an interesting speech made years ago, almost now, more than 25 years ago, 2003. Mahathir Mohamad, the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, was addressing 57 leaders of the Organization of Islamic Conference meeting in 2003. And he said, and I quote, "Today, the Jews rule the world by proxy. We are up against a people who think. They survived 2,000 years of pogroms, not by hitting back, but by thinking. They invented socialism, communism, human rights, and democracy." Now, most people wouldn't quote a virulent anti-Semite, a hater of Jews, like Mahathir Mohamad in a discussion of the bases of human rights. He also happens to be a dictatorial tyrant who is no respecter of human rights and democracy. But the reason I bring that quote at the beginning of this discussion is to validate a general understanding that Jews, for whatever reason, have been, and we'll talk about the reasons, have been at the forefront of the movements that he mentioned. Now, he, of course, mentioned this as in a derogatory way, but it was kind of a backhanded compliment, because he was saying we, the Muslims of the world, should be more actively involved in thinking, in philosophy, or however you want to put it. But aside from that kind of backhanded compliment, there's a lot of proof in history in terms of their action of Jews having been involved in or leading all sorts of different rights movements, if you will. The U.S. civil rights movements in the 60s were joined by leaders of the Jewish community, most notable among them Solomon Schechter, but many other rabbis, Reform, Orthodox, and conservative, for those of you who either are Jewish or understand something of the distinctions, the different segments of the Jewish population. But it's true about the South African anti-apartheid movement, both in South Africa and also leading on college campuses and in communities in America and throughout the West in trying to come to terms with or oppose and overthrow the South African apartheid regime. It's certainly true with regard to the USSR, the former Soviet Union's human rights movement, not just Natan Sharansky, who I mentioned, but many other Jews who were involved or leading the human rights movement there in the former Soviet Union. And it's true also in terms of those in America, France, Britain, and other Western countries which promoted those movements. And even if you go back to over 150 years ago to the United States movement against slavery. The anti-slavery movement was both joined by and in some places led by many members of the Jewish community, including, for the record, some in my own family. Some of you may know that I'm a direct descendant, as is my father, of one of the first Jewish families that came to these shores and have been here for well over 200 years, since actually 1690 and 1730, 1690 in Montreal and 1730 or 1720 in what was then New Amsterdam. But having said that, it raises a question. Why? Why are Jews as a people so very involved in these movements? And in fact, you can go one step further and note that the founders of some of the many of the political movements in modern society, socialism, communism, which I'm not making a political statement, good, bad, or otherwise, they've been proven in history not to have been necessarily all that effective, but their goals of achieving some sort of equality, their goals of trying to bring benefits to their societies, whether it's Karl Marx, Leon Trotsky, or others, very frequently also were Jews. So we have to kind of trace back to the roots of democratic and modern Western political theory to discover something very interesting. If you're familiar with Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, if you're familiar with Kant, with Thomas Jefferson, with St. Grotius, St. Augustine, even Plato and Socrates, if you follow that line of thinkers, from modern democratic thinkers like Jefferson through Augustine and St. Grotius, the originators of some of our legal Western philosophy, back to Plato and Socrates, what you find is you can trace all of that back to one source, a single source, which is recognized by them, and that is the Torah. The 5 books of Moses, the Torah, and the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, which is the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, and then the Talmud, the Mishnah and the Gemara, which is the ancient compilation about 2,000 years ago of the laws, practices, and philosophies that were part of normative tradition within the Jewish world based on the Torah and based on the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. I mean, there's all sorts of other contributions by the Jewish people to philosophy, to the world of philosophy and law, whether it's Spinoza, Mendelssohn, others like Maimonides, and what have you. But one of the basic things that we've seen is a recognition by all of the people I mentioned, even Kant, who is a known anti-Semite, a hater of Jews, acknowledged, and much more so, and obviously in a more positive way, Thomas Jefferson and Rousseau and others acknowledged their debt to the Torah, to the Hebrew Bible. And it raises the question, what is that debt? What is the concept, the fundamental basis that we're referring to? And I think you could narrow it down, although we'll go into some more details on some specifics that have real application in today's world. But if you go back to the very, very root, the very source, I think that you can come up with an understanding that the primary innovation of the Hebrew Bible and the Torah and the giving of the law to Moses and the story of the Jewish people as a people that started as a family with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, became a clan, became a tribe, became a nation. In fact, we just celebrated the holiday of Passover, which is the commemoration, really, of the emergence of the people of Israel as a national identity, as opposed to simply just a clan or a tribe. And all of that is going back to the basic religious, spiritual, philosophical tenet that was introduced by the Hebrew Bible, by Moses to the people of Israel, which was relatively radical at the time. And what was that tenet? The sanctity of life. The value of life as the highest value, the highest moral principle or basis on which to create a society or laws to govern that society. I want to go a little bit more into detail of what we mean, or what I mean when I refer to that. And by the way, a lot of what I'm saying today is based on another Supreme Court justice here in Israel, a lawyer, and a real student of the Talmud, the Gemara, the Mishnah, and the Hebrew Bible, Chaim Cohen, who wrote a book about human rights and the tradition of the laws of Israel, meaning the laws not of the state of Israel today, but the laws of the people of Israel. And for the record, the laws of the state of Israel today reflect much of what I'm saying, and it's one of the kind of miracles of the modern world that when laws are decided by the Supreme Court of Israel, sometimes the reference point is not necessarily a more modern piece of legislation, or our laws in Israel are based on not just Israeli law, but previous British law when they were the mandatory power here, Ottoman law before that, kind of a hodgepodge of legal systems coming together. But one of those bases actually is the Hebrew Bible, which is quoted with some frequency within the context of different decisions by the Israeli court system. But having said that, all of this comes back to this issue of the sanctity of life. And where does that come from? Well, if we open our Bible and we read the first chapter of the Bible, of Genesis, what we see is a very interesting concept, that humanity was created by God, and it doesn't matter whether you're religious or not, whether you believe or not. We're talking about a historical understanding of the development of modern Western legal or philosophical theories. And it goes back to this even today, irrespective of whether the word God or creator or what have you has relevance to you in your life. And of course, if you're atheist, if you're Christian, if you're Jewish, you can be part of this conversation, both as a historical analysis and theoretical analysis, irrespective of your own belief system. What we see in that chapter of Genesis and the creation of humanity, of human beings, is that man or women or mankind was created in the image of God. Those are the words used, B'Tselem Elokim, in the image of God. What does actually that mean? It means that we have a basis for an understanding of how we are to relate to each other, to other human beings. Now, this is generally acknowledged within the context of those that I mentioned before, Rousseau, Kant, Jefferson, and others. But what I want to do is I want to explore and go a little bit deeper of how that general concept of understanding that humanity is created in the image of God has applications from the Hebrew Bible, from the Torah-mandated system of laws and rules for behavior which apply to the Jewish people, to the people of Israel, but also to all humanity from a number of different perspectives. It's a bit of an esoteric discussion we'll leave for another time. But what's important to recognize is that within the biblical framework of laws, we have all sorts of issues that are related exactly to these, to this principle. So we have issues related to how we treat slaves, how we treat minorities that are living among us, how we deal with issues like women's rights. I mean, these are modern issues, but they go back to the time of the Bible and the Talmud. Business ethics, democratic decision-making within the community, and of course, leading up to an understanding of human rights, of what are the basic and fundamental and universal rights that we have. So what I like to relate to is, without going into a lot of details, I have all sorts of source material. If you're interested, I'll be happy to send it to you in Hebrew. Also, actually, I have some which has translations in English. But because our time is limited, I just want to mention a few which are central. So, for instance, in Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the fathers, which is a Mishnah, which is part of the Talmud, the earliest commentary, thank you, the earliest commentary on the Hebrew Bible, we have a number of sayings which basically translate the concept of humanity created in the image of God into real action, into behavior, into how we are meant to relate to one another, how we can honor both God and our fellow man or woman. And the references are general but also specific. We should imitate God. We're created in the image of God, and we should honor God and each other. So how? So I started to mention in the sayings of the fathers, Pirkei Avot, in the second chapter there, let your fellow man's honor be as dear to you as your own. Connected to our the phrase, the sentence that I mentioned from Genesis, Avot de Rabbi Natan, in the sayings of Rabbi Nathan, where respect and dignity is a central message and a result of this concept of being created in the image of God. Who is honored in chapter 4 of the Ethics of the Fathers? Who is honored? One who honors his fellow human being. In the Gemara, which is the later section of the Talmud, the commentary on the commentary, we see in Baba Metzia, in one of the books of the Gemara, whoever shames his fellow being in public is considered as if he has shed blood. So here we have an interesting parallel between the sanctity of life, actual life, and the dignity we are meant to give to other human beings, which is equivalent to giving them life or protecting their life. We see, if we go back to other parts of the Hebrew Bible, in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 2, there is a very specific statement, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy, which is where we get our tradition, and our sages got the concept of imitating God in his heavenly acts. Because he is holy, we should be holy. And these are very specific. Rashi, the most well-known commentator, medieval commentator on the Bible, specifically says, just as God helps the poor, we should help the poor. Just as God heals the sick, we should heal the sick. And he brings specific references from the Hebrew Bible to demonstrate this. It's not just a generic, we should heal the sick. God, according to our tradition, comes and visits Abraham when Abraham is recovering from his own circumcision. And there is a specific reference to that in the Hebrew Bible. And Jewish tradition notes that God's appearance to Abraham while he was recovering was, in a sense, a visit to somebody who's healing from an operation. And so Rashi says, the medieval commentator Rashi says, we should visit the sick just as God visits the sick. And there are all sorts of other examples like that. Separately, but similarly, in the book of Deuteronomy, in Dvarim, in chapter 13, verse 5, the Hebrew Bible says, or Moses says, you shall walk after the Lord, which is another way of saying you should emulate him. So the Gemara, in a different section, in Sota, talks about specifics like clothing Adam and Eve. If God clothed Adam and Eve, so we should clothe the poor. I mentioned visiting Abraham when he was ill, which we should do the same. God comforted Isaac after the death of his mother, and so should we comfort mourners. And there are all sorts of other actions like that. The point is that there are obligatory behaviors that are brought down in Jewish tradition from the Hebrew Bible to ensure dignity and to ensure that we do emulate and can emulate God. And what's fascinating is that leads to some specific rights. And it's a different perspective than an American or a Western perspective of rights. And I'll get to that in a second. But what do I mean by specific rights? So we have a right to life. The right to life is very specific. Rabbi Akiva, one of the most well-known and most beloved sages of the time of the Talmud, said, whoever sheds blood, it's as if he decreased the image of God. Which is to say, you don't have the right to take the life of another human being because that human being is a reflection of the dignity of the divine. Issues of property rights are very specifically described in the Hebrew Bible and in the Talmud and in later sages, rabbis, and judges. Shabbat laws, the day of rest, and the rights of workers are explicitly discussed in the Hebrew Bible and later works. There's all sorts of discussions and basis for issues of freedom of speech and freedom of opinion. There's a wonderful story, which I won't go into, also in the Talmud, about Rabbi Eliezer, who calls on a voice of heaven in an argument among the sages on a particular esoteric piece of law, it doesn't matter what. And he says, a voice of heaven should come. One of the others, Rabbi Eliezer, calls for the voice of heaven should come down and prove and show that I'm right. And lo and behold, a voice from heaven, the heavens open up, and a voice says, Rav Eliezer is right. But Rabbi Joshua says, hold on a second. The law is not in heaven. The law is down here. We have been enjoined to be decisors of what the law is, and it's our majority, not in heaven, that is the deciding factor. And that issue of majority rule in the Sanhedrin, in the body of the sages back in the Talmudical times, and in much later works, including today, the concept of majority rule is based on biblical sources. And for the record, the protection of minority rights, and I was saying the right of freedom of speech, the right to speak out, which implies freedom of the press, obviously freedom of conscience, freedom of movement, and freedom of assembly, and issues of not allowing unfair imprisonment. All of these are actually mentioned very explicitly in the Hebrew Bible or in later works like the Talmud or medieval philosophical works based on biblical concepts. And as I mentioned before, women's rights, minorities' rights, equality, issues of equality and protection, these are all part and parcel of this wonderful system of Jewish law and Hebrew and Israeli philosophy based on the Hebrew Bible. Now, I mentioned that there's something different between that and the Western system, and the difference is profound, I think, and something that we can perhaps take away from in our own understanding of how we should behave and how we should relate to our government throughout the Western world. What am I referring to? In the United States, and actually in the international community based on the United Nations, for instance, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we relate to rights. I have a right, we say. We're talking about entitlement. I have a right to property. I have a right to life. I have a right to freedom of speech or what have you. But Judaism has a slightly different approach. While it protects those rights, it does so from the standpoint of prescribing, defining the responsibility of leaders, parents, teachers, humanity, the responsibility that we have to ensure those rights are protected. What do I mean? I mean, for instance, we just finished, as I mentioned, the holiday of Passover, where we had our Seder night. Many of us alone in our homes or through Zoom, which I know my mom organized for many of you there at Smith Ranch. One of the central sayings in the Passover Seder is "V'higadata levincha b'yom ha'hu," and you shall teach your child on that day. Now, this relates to the issue of relaying from generation to generation the commemoration of our freedom from slavery and the exodus of Egypt. But the general concept of the commandment to teach your children, to educate your children, is a fundamental Jewish principle. And therefore, that responsibility to teach your children implies a right on the part of children to education. But it's understood, I think, from a much more powerful basis. It's not only that a child has a right to an education, which is now a universally recognized right in the UN and what have you, but it implies that there's action that we have to take in order to ensure that right. For instance, the issue of assisting the poor that I mentioned once or twice earlier, that implies a right to a livelihood, that people have a right to make a living. Especially if you understand Maimonides' 8 levels of charitable giving, the highest level of charitable giving is to provide actually employment for or an occupation, to teach an occupation to an indigent person, to enable them to provide for themselves. So the idea of assisting the poor implies a right to livelihood, but again, the obligation falls on the people to ensure that right. There is a commandment, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with in the 10 Commandments, not to steal. And that obligation not to steal implies a right to ownership of property. Of course, we're all familiar with the other very well-known commandment of the 10, not to murder. For the record, as an aside, there's no commandment not to kill. There are times when one must kill. This is not a discussion of the right to self-defense or what have you, but there is a very wide misunderstanding that commandment is thou shalt not kill. It is not. The proper translation is thou shalt not murder. And what is that commandment not to murder, not to take the life of others without obviously any sort of mandate to do so? And what I mentioned earlier about the one who, what Rabbi Akiva said, whoever sheds blood, it's as if he decreased the image. This issue of taking a single life being collating actually two things. What Rabbi Akiva said about diminishing the image is paralleled by another reference in a different Gemara, in a different Talmud called Sanhedrin, where the issue of taking of a single life is considered to be akin to destroying the world. And all of this, not to murder, not to take a single life, decreasing, not to decrease the image by shedding blood, all of these imply a right to life. Now the point that I'm making is that the rights that we're referring to, while very important and central to our understanding in the Western world, unfortunately don't often come with obligations. Certainly not in the way that I'm defining or I'm describing now. Think about the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. The text there talks about a right to live, to be free, to feel safe, but there's no obligation there. The Torah provides a context to ensure these rights. The Hebrew Bible and Jewish tradition provide a framework for the responsibility of those either in power, and in power I mean in government, but also in power even in the home as a parent, or in the school as a teacher, or in society, to ensure that those rights. So we can compare, for instance, in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, there's a reference to equal protection under the law. But in the Hebrew Bible, in Leviticus, it's written that there should be one standard for the stranger and the citizen. In other words, this is the parallel to, or the other side of the coin. I think one of the issues that we discuss within Jewish tradition is an issue of kavod ha'adam, or kavod ha'briut, the honor of humanity, the honor of creation, and the honor maybe isn't the best translation, the importance to respect life, to respect the other, to respect creation. These are explicit within the context of the Hebrew Bible and later Jewish thought. Now, I want to call your attention, just kind of in conclusion, to a very interesting element of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. There's a quote there that says, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood." And I want you to note there's an implied duty here. They should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Where did that come from? Well, René Cassin, who was one of the architects of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, who was a Nobel winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, then later in 1968, a French Jew, mentions the idea of human dignity and rights, mentions the fact that when that idea was introduced in an essay that René Cassin wrote called From the Ten Commandments to the Rights of Man, there's a specific mention that this idea of dignity and rights came from the Jewish scriptures. So it's kind of an interesting understanding then of why it is that our Western society sees these things as so important. Obviously, you can be an atheist, you can be a Buddhist, and not in the tradition, as it were, of Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, which are based on the Hebrew Bible, but still can recognize where these come from and how powerful these concepts are. Because just to come back to the Hebrew Bible, the prophet Malachi says in chapter 2, verse 10, "Have we not all one Father? Has not one God created us?" Talking about humanity, not simply the Jewish people. Why do we deal treacherously, every man against his brother? the whole concept of prejudice, of racism, sexism is just inconsistent with Torah ideals, meaning inconsistent with Jewish values and with the tradition that the people of Israel, that the Jewish people have brought into modern society over the last 3,500 years. This idea of human dignity being based on the concept that humanity was created in the image of God. I want to leave you with one I think, lovely kind of story quote from the Talmud, because I see that our time is coming to a close. And I think that it's relevant for the season that we're in now, not just Passover, but also Easter, which many of us celebrated just recently, and even Ramadan, which is also starting just now. There is a classic argument between Rabbi Akiva, who I mentioned before, a beloved sage of Talmudical times, and Ben Azai. This is in the Jerusalem Talmud, if you're at all interested in looking it up, in the book Nidarim, Vows, on page 9. And it's basically an argument about what is the fundamental principle that summarizes the entire Torah. How can we summarize on one leg, as it were, as Rabbi Hillel did at one point, which you may be familiar with? I'll refer to that in a second. How do we summarize the most basic and fundamental platform on which the whole edifice of Jewish law and philosophy and behavior and psychology and the organization of a free and equal society is based on, from a Jewish and a Torah perspective? And the argument basically goes like this. Rabbi Akiva says that in Vayikra, in Leviticus 19, chapter 19, verse 18, the phrase, "You shall love your fellow as yourself," that should be the fundamental principle that summarizes the entire Torah. But Ben Azai says, no, Bereshit, chapter 5, in Genesis chapter 5, the phrase, "This is the book of the generations of Adam, of man, of humanity." This is the book of the generations of humanity. On the day that God created humanity, God made humanity in the likeness of God. So this raises an interesting question. If you think of Rabbi Akiva's, I mentioned Rabbi Hillel, who you know, who said, "What is hateful to you, do not do unto others." That was a paraphrase of Rabbi Akiva's quoting of the biblical premise from Leviticus, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." The problem is the principle of loving your fellow human, according to Hillel, of not doing what's hateful to you, don't do to your neighbor. It's a lofty ideal, but it's problematic, really, in application, especially if you don't care about your own dignity. If you don't care about your own dignity, then infringing on another's dignity still adheres to that principle of not doing to others what you would find hateful to yourself. But if all humanity, if all of humankind is actually based in, is made in, created in the likeness of God, in the likeness of the creator of the universe, or if you will, as a reflection of the wonder and infinite power and spirituality of humanity and the universe altogether, if humankind is created in that likeness, call it God or what have you, then you have to respect all people. It really doesn't matter how you feel about any particular behavior, any particular concept. And there's a midrash in Bereshit Rabbah, in the Genesis, the commentary of the midrash on Genesis, which says explicitly within the context of the quote that we've now returned to a number of times about humanity being created in the image of God, that if you insult another person, you insult that person's creator, because we were created in the image of God. Well, I just want to, that was kind of a very quick review of some of the bases and specific applications of our Jewish tradition on modern Western political thought. I hope that you've enjoyed and followed along the argument. I can go into a lot more details with regard to democracy, majority rule, minority rights, and the like, but I think that you can follow along the logic to understand that there is a very specific continuum and a real constant thread between the introduction of these basic ideas of living in dignity and giving dignity to our fellow human beings, introduced to the world from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses in the Jewish tradition, that were then adopted and accepted within Christian theology and philosophy. And I mentioned St. Grotius, St. Augustine, and others, and then through to Jefferson, Rousseau, and the like, and up to and including today. Very, very strongly, these themes still play when we want to promote issues like women's rights or objection to slavery, still today, which unfortunately does exist in some parts of the world, and the like. I want to finish with one quote from the Meiri, from Rav Meiri, in a different Talmud, in Brachot, the first book of the Talmud, on page 19, where he says something very, very clear. He says, the attribute of kavod habriot, the attribute of respecting all of creation, is very precious to God, that there is no virtue more beloved than that. And I'll just leave that thought with you and say thank you very much for your time and for listening. I hope you've enjoyed, and I look forward to being in touch again soon. And although I'm very sorry I'm not there with you on the 17th of April as planned, I certainly hope I'll be able to both connect with you further, depending on how long this situation continues, online in this format, or perhaps in an interactive Zoom online interface, if we can set that sort of thing up, and much more. I look forward to seeing all of you, including my parents and all my friends there at Smith Ranch, very, very soon, in person. Please God, we should all be well. In the interim, stay safe, and I like to say also, stay sane. All the best, and have a wonderful and a lovely spring.